Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, which launched today. The Toolbox is an online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Whether you are a pastor, missions committee member, or family or friend of a mission worker, we want to help you in your role as a sender. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back for this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. I am super excited about this episode, and I know I say that a lot, but it's really true. Today's conversation is going to be a little different than usual because we're not going to focus on any one topic. Instead, we're going to go right to the core purpose of the Global Missions Toolbox, and that is providing practical resources for the missions programs in a local church. We hope that you'll be inspired with the ideas and encouraged that there are great resources out there to help you build vision and traction in your church. Our guest today, Justin, has deep and broad experience in working with many churches, and we're going to list and discuss some of his recommendations. Now, these resources have been lightly organized in order of complexity. We've tried to put some of the introductory tools first, and then progressively increase the depth and complexity as a church grows in its program for global missions and its awareness and capacity to engage the unreached. Now, today we are going to mention a lot of books and websites and resources, so I'll mention again our show notes, which you can find on our website, globalmissionspodcast.com. All of the resources mentioned today, links, etc., will all be available there. Now, just before we get to our conversation with Justin, and Christian already mentioned this in the opening, the Global Missions Toolbox launched today. Our team is super excited about this new resource designed especially for pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of missionaries, the senders. Next week, just 7 days from now, we will have a special bonus episode of the podcast so that you can learn about how the Global Missions Toolbox can be helpful to you and your church. Now, over to our conversation with Justin. Our guest today is Justin, who serves as a mobilizer at Cafe 1040. That's a ministry we're going to learn more about in just a few minutes. Justin grew up in the United States, in Texas, actually, surrounded by churches, but grew up in a home that did not care about Jesus or Christianity. And when he was 18, God grabbed his heart and opened his eyes to the gospel. He has served as a youth pastor and then worked in the corporate world, and now since 2017 has worked for Cafe 1040. He is married and has 2 kids. Justin, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Max.
Really looking forward to our discussion today and how the Lord has brought your previous experience forward into this particular ministry. Just take a minute, if you would, and tell us a bit about your mission journey and how you became involved with Cafe 1040.
Yeah, so for me, I got saved when I was in college. I was 18 years old, and I had a ravenous hunger for the scriptures. And so I dove into it and was just reading my Bible and saw 2 kind of overarching themes or meta-narratives. One was just the story of redemption and God's glory from Genesis all the way to Revelation. And then the second was just one of his main methodologies that he uses, which seemed to be pulling people out of their current cultural context and moving them to a different one. Mm-hmm. And so from seeing that, I kind of gained the idea that God seemed to be really about what we call missions. Mm-hmm. For me, though, at that point, I didn't feel like God was calling me overseas, so I didn't know what that looked like. My only idea of what missions could be was either you sent money to a missionary or you moved overseas. Mm-hmm. So I did what any young person does, and I became a youth pastor. Did that for a season after I got married, and then went into the corporate world. And while I was working at that job, I had a friend that called me he was raising support to become a mobilizer for this organization called Cafe 1040. And when he shared the vision of Cafe and what he'd be doing, I learned that there was so much more that you could do with missions rather than just send money or go. Mm. And when that happened, it just caught my heart, and I applied and got hired.
Wow. I think that's going to be a great encouragement to some of our listeners, because we don't want it to be limited, like you said, to either one or the other, just these simple answers, but there's so many gifts, so many backgrounds that the Lord can use in his, we call it a grand adventure, right, of global missions. Cafe 1040, tell us a little bit about Cafe.
Yeah, Cafe 1040, the funny thing is the name is a bit of a misnomer. We don't have anything to do with coffee. We drink a lot of it and we really enjoy good coffee, but we don't sell it. We don't have cafes. It's just a catchy name.
I see.
But the mission of Cafe 1040 is to mobilize a generation to tell the story of Jesus where it's never been told before. And one of the primary ways that we do that is through an overseas missions mentorship program for young adults that are asking the question whether they're called to move overseas long term. Another way that we help with that is that we partner with local churches to help them develop a kind of a missions pathway or a mobilization plan for their church to help encourage their congregation towards mobilization.
Well, this is right up the alley of the Global Missions podcast to try and encourage local churches, both in the support of workers who are sent, but also in the cultivation and the readying of workers. This term mentorship, we want to unpack that a little bit. When you say a missions mentorship at the cafe, even though you don't have coffee, what do you mean by a missions mentorship?
Yeah, one of the things that we've found is that for young adults, they learn a lot by doing. And most of the missions experience that they could have gained before, 20 years ago when we started, was that either they could go on a 1 week or a 2 week mission trip cross-culturally, and they would come back, get super excited about it, and want to explore more. And then they would have the option to go 2 years. And there was just a massive gap in between a 2 week trip and a 2 year commitment. So what we do is we provide a 3-month mentorship overseas in restricted access countries or amongst unreached people groups. And while those students are overseas, they spend a small amount of time in kind of a classroom setting where we teach them about different missions methodologies. We teach them the biblical basis for missions. We teach them language acquisition skills, the major religion in the area, things like that, as well as practical life skills, how to buy food in the market when you don't speak the language, how to get from point A to point B using their public transportation, etc. And then the mass majority of their time is actually experiencing the culture. So we've taught them about the culture, go and make friends in the culture. We've taught them about how to share the gospel in a safe and sustainable way. Well, when presented with the opportunity, do so. And in the midst of all that, our overseas staff is walking alongside them through, their culture shock that they're going through, their homesickness, coming to the realization that this is their life now, feeling that culture is now home, as well as navigating the difficulties of working on a team and the conflict that can arise, the things that the Lord is showing them while they're overseas, as well as the conflicts that they may arise in just experiencing a different culture and trying to make friends in that culture and share the gospel in that culture.
Wow, I really appreciate just the entire intention here. And I know we're going to talk about something else. Our main topic has to do with resources. We'll get there. But this idea of what we sometimes called a middle term, short term being a week or two. And many of our listeners, their churches have participated in that. Sometimes as young people or students, they'll do a week or two. And then, like you said, there's this long range commitment of years at a time. But what's in between? And a semester or a few weeks. This was my experience. I had a term that was about 12 weeks on the field in my case. And I remember being at the 3 to 4 week point, and I thought I was going to break. I didn't know I could do any more. The waves of culture shock were washing over me.
Yeah.
And it was so important that I was there and went through that to the other side, as challenging as it was. And with the help of local workers and all that, this middle range, I really want to encourage, especially students. If you're listening, you could consider a semester or one of these very tailored mentorships from the cafe. Spend a bit more time than just a couple of weeks. You need to be there long enough to do your laundry.
Yeah.
And really get into it. And it's not necessarily the rest of your life, but it will enrich your life by investing in this way. Well, way to go, Justin, for investing in this way.
Thank you.
I want to make sure I've got it right here. It's cafe1040.com. It'll be in the show notes, but we want to invite you to go by the website there and have a visit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Justin, today we want to talk about practical tools. This is really the heart of the Global Missions Toolbox and the podcast that we're on. We want to help strengthen missions in local churches. And we hope that if you're a church leader or part of a missions committee and you're listening today, that this will be especially helpful to you. Where should we begin, Justin, as we want to get to some practical tools to help in local churches?
Yeah, I think for a local church, which I got to say, I'm so glad that you guys have this podcast. I know I work for a parachurch organization, but man, I really believe very strongly in the bride of Christ and that we are at best bridesmaids, just here to help.
Amen.
So I'm very, very excited about this podcast and just the heart behind it. But I think for a lot of churches, just making that initial step of raising awareness is pretty profound and can have a massive impact. And so some tools that I recommend for churches that are really just wanting to start out and get to know what's going on in the world, kind of raise some awareness. Man, the first tool that I recommend is Joshua Project. I think in a conversation we had earlier, you had mentioned that there's a podcast that you guys did about Joshua Project that goes more in depth.
Yes.
So I would, encourage people to dive into that. But Joshua Project is a great first step because it's extremely low commitment from anybody, and it's really easy to get into. So you can either go to the website of joshuaproject.org or you can download the app. And I really recommend downloading the app because it'll just send you every day a new people group that you can learn about, the prayer points to pray about them. So you're not in this ambiguity of, okay, so there's this unreached people group in some place that I'm completely unfamiliar with. How am I supposed to pray for these people? But you start to gain an awareness of the unreached people that are out there, the type of people that they are, what their culture is like, where they're located, and specific ways that you can pray for them. And I think when you start to gain that understanding, when your congregation begins to have that really low bar investment, man, the Lord just used that to stir our hearts to what he's doing around the globe. And so I think Joshua Project is a really good one to step into, and it's beneficial throughout the entire process, right?
Yes.
But it's a really low bar for somebody at the very beginning. And then a book that has been praised throughout the missions world is just the book Radical by David Platt.
Right.
That's another really good one to, kind of kickstart, throw some gasoline on the fire, if you will. That's a really engaging read. It's very easy to read. It's very fun, but it's also very convicting and very, very challenging. But it's a fantastic read.
Yes. Two great resources here. And I want to ask you in a minute, Justin, just about how you see that rolling out in a church. I'm going to pile on, though, Joshua Project. It's a one-stop initial place to be doing research. And just an idea for those of you that might be on a missions committee or a pastor. We tried this in a church here in Ontario, where during the Sunday morning service where I was talking about missions, we went live onto the Joshua Project website in that case and chose the countries where that church had mission workers serving. And we went live with the website up on the screen and went and checked it out there. You can actually do a little demo live, and we took the prayer request right off of the screen and prayed for our workers using that. And so just encourage the creative use of that. Anyone, of course, can stop by the website and benefit from it. You can promote it in some of those ways. Justin, what are some of the ways that you have seen churches making use of these tools, the Joshua Project, Radical, and others?
Yeah, I think the one that you just mentioned is huge. Incorporating Joshua Project into a Sunday service, even a regularly Sunday service. So every Sunday you choose the country that's up or one that you have workers in, and specifically praying for that country as part of your service really puts it in front of your congregation in a very easy way. And it's not like you've got to program 30 minutes to do it. You could program 3.
Exactly.
And knock it out of the park and really get that into the DNA of the church. And then as far as the book Radical, man, if you've got small groups, community groups, life groups, whatever you call them, Sunday school, taking a season to read through Radical or encourage those leaders to lead their groups through that book and have discussions around it. I found when I read through that book, when I was a youth pastor, man, I wanted to talk to people because I had questions, I had thoughts. I wanted people around me that were reading that book to help process everything that was going on in my heart. And so having those as discussions, I think is extremely fruitful. And once again, a pretty low bar just to take a season to step aside and say, hey, we really want to put a focus on this book just for a season.
Yeah.
I think is a really easy first step, or at least a simple first step to get things moving.
And Radical, Pastor David writes in a very accessible fashion, right? I wouldn't say it's an easy read, not the content, because it's very challenging, but it's not a difficult read. This is not a textbook we're talking about. It's very engaging.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely written to the mass populace and not to doctoral students at a seminary.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we're out of the gate. A couple of great recommendations. Take us onward.
Yeah. Some other things that I would recommend are some organizations that produce some great things. One is the Center for Missions Mobilization. But within that, they have some fantastic studies. Like there's Explore Study. It's a 5-6 week study. I think that you can buy booklets for like $5. They're very cheap, or you can just download the PDF for free. And they're great group studies. They have questions already built in. So once again, it's a plug and play study. We have all of our mobilizers go through that study so that they're familiar with it. And we've had a lot of our mobilizers lead groups of young adults through that study to help them gain an idea of what it looks like to be a world Christian. And so when I say world Christian, when my idea of missions was send money or go, that's not a world Christian. There are many different options that are available and many different roles to play. And Explore Study really dives into those and helps see that we can all participate, even if we're not called to go overseas.
Right.
They also have something called Big Story Series, and that's written for children, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So it could be a family study.
That's super. And I just want to note too, it's like we're saying we're starting to get to a little bit more depth, right? We started with Radical, Pastor David Platt's book, and now we're starting to get into things that are a little more demanding. It's like a next level sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, we're not talking super high bar, but I think that Radical will kind of stir your heart into oh my goodness, I need to do something. What should I do?
Right.
And then an Explore Study or Big Story Series can help you say, okay, so here are some paths that I can take to really take that next step. Another is a book called Spiritual Multiplication in the Real World, and that's written by a guy named Bob McNabb.
Okay.
That's a book. It has some challenges to it. That is, once again, it's a bit more of a commitment than the Explore Study.
Right.
And there's a study guide that goes along with it that challenges you to put things into practice. So they break it down into what they call a 3-2-1, and it's a commitment to 3 hours in the scripture a week. So not a day. So it's 30 minutes a day with a day of grace. And then 2 hours, what they call fishing. And fishing is just going out and, talking to your neighbors, seeing what you can pray for them about, sharing the story of Jesus, sharing your story with Jesus with them, just being intentional with some of your time. And then an hour actually studying it, or in a group going through, what are you guys experiencing? How is this going? What are you learning? Things of that nature. Yeah. And so then another great book is Across the Street and Around the World by Jeannie Marie. And that's just another phenomenal book that opens your eyes even further into what can you be doing, right? Those are some next steps that I would say are a little bit more of a commitment than Joshua Project or Radical, but they're really good steps. And really, when you break down being intentional with mobilizing your congregation towards global missions and just participation in that, it's a progressive thing. It takes steps. It's not a wake up one day and we've arrived. And so I would say these are kind of the next step.
That is a great note to submit at this point, to say that this is a building process, and we're not asking God's people to make massive adjustments necessarily. Sometimes the Lord works that way, but there's a learning process and an investment of learning over time. You mentioned inserting things into the DNA of a church, and these are some of the tools ongoing. Jeannie Marie is a friend of the podcast, and only a few episodes ago, we had an interview with Jeannie Marie. We'll include that in the show notes as well. And I'll just say again to everyone, if you're a regular listener, you know this, all of these resources, links, or book titles will be included in the show notes. You can find those at globalmissionspodcast.com. I wonder, when do you see change beginning to take place in that DNA as these tools are being used?
Yeah, I think the introduction of Explore Studies, of Big Story Series, of Spiritual Multiplication in the Real World, you start to see it pretty small. It's a small group here, it's a small group there. They're going through these things, but then they get out of those studies and they begin to tell more people. And then you start to see this, it's not rapid, but it is exponential.
Sure.
Of now you had one group, now you have three. Once you had three, now you're getting six. And it just kind of grows in that fashion of people that are seeing these people take what they're learning and actually applying it and moving forward towards these things, and the joy that they're experiencing from it, and saying, man, what are you doing and how do I do it?
Yeah.
And so you start to see this progressive sweep throughout your congregation, and the interest really does it begins to grow. Not like a wildfire. That would be cool.
Right. Yeah.
But it has a little bit of a domino effect.
There's that flywheel idea, right? Where you push on it and it begins to get a little bit of its own momentum, carries through to others naturally.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. Well, let's go on to the next level then. What's next in your list?
Yeah, so when we're talking about Explore study, we've talked 5-6 weeks. The spiritual multiplication in the real world is about a 10-week study, so you've gotten to that next step commitment. After that, a class that I would highly, highly, highly recommend is Perspectives. Now, that's a commitment on 2 different levels. There is a cost associated with taking the class.
Right.
I couldn't tell you the exact dollar amount, but I can tell you it's worth every penny. And it's a 15, 16-week commitment. You need to show up every week. There is reading involved in between the classes, but it is Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. For the sake of perspectives, I got to throw out, it is not a missions course. It is a discipleship course. However, there is a high missions emphasis because of how much God is doing in the world of missions. So while it's not a missions course, you can't get away from it and not kind of be fired up about missions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so many people across, I'll say the Western world, I know it's translated as well, but have just been deeply impacted by this course, and it is a significant investment. I have been an instructor in part of a Perspectives course here in Canada. And in fact, again, in the podcast, we have an episode with the Canadian director of the Perspectives program, Wayne Matthews. If you think this might be something you'd like to learn more about, we'll put that in the show notes and you can listen to Wayne's explanation. They offer this in person when possible and also online. So there are various ways that this can be engaged. And like Justin said, it leaves congregations changed. People are changed by spending these 15, 16 weeks. Really, really good stuff.
Absolutely. The impact of Perspectives just cannot be overstated.
Yeah, we'll see in heaven. Hey, Justin, it's going to be one of those things, the Jesus film, the Perspectives course, where God just took these things and used them so powerfully. Praise the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. God has done profound things through Perspectives. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would recommend, there's an organization called Beyond. It's a long-term sending organization, but they put out, I want to say it's monthly, these webinars that you can log into called Nuggets. Now, this is, I would say, a higher level because it is very specific towards missions and those that are interested in missions and learning about different cultures, different ways to engage those cultures. But the content that they put out and the content that you cover in that is just fantastic. And so I would say at this point, you probably have some people in your congregation that are interested in long-term missions,
right,
Lord willing. And these Nuggets trainings are phenomenal things that they can do. I got to confess, I don't know if there's a cost involved. I don't believe that there is. And I could be wrong, but it's a great way to gain some more insight into long-term missions, what that looks like, what it entails, and how to engage cross-culturally in their context and not in your own. And so those are fantastic little webinars that you can log into.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, believe it or not, we still have 2 more levels of resources to share. I'm going to ask Justin in just a few minutes to unpack those with us. Before we get to that part of our conversation, however, we'd like to share with you this resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Did you know there are over 500 million Buddhists living around the world? There are also thousands of believers like you who pray for our Buddhist friends and neighbors. The 15 Days of Prayer for the Buddhist World Guide can help you learn about and pray more effectively for Buddhists around the world. You can participate in 15 Days of Prayer for the Buddhist world by setting aside any 15 days of the year. To learn more, visit 15daysprayer.com and order your copy today. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we are back with Justin, the mobilization team leader from Cafe 1040. Just as that goes by, Justin, I was going to ask, how did you get the name Cafe 1040? That might be a springboard here, right?
Yeah, sure. So it comes out of a failed idea. When we first started 20 years ago, our founder had this idea. He moved his family to North Africa to establish our first base.
Mm-hmm.
And the thought was that we would start a cafe and students would come over and they'd work in the cafe and they would engage with locals. A very gracious worker that was overseas with Africa Inland Mission heard the idea and was just like, I think it's a really creative idea, but it'll never work. There are local cafes all over the place, and locals are going to go to where they've always gone.
Right.
And as far as a creative access thing there, the government's going to wonder how you're staying in business when nobody is coming to your coffee shop and why your turnover rate of employees is so high. So we left that concept and we went with a different creative access, but he had already applied for the 501c3 with the name Cafe 1040.
Yep. So there it is.
So there it is.
Very good. Well, you're in good company because Velcro, sticky notes, and Instagram all came through failed ideas. So you're in good company there. Good ideas come from places we don't expect. Okay, so we have been reviewing some of Justin's recommended tools. We've talked about 3 levels, right from the very entry level of reading a book or visiting a website, through some discipleship studies, then into some deeper training studies. Justin, what are some of the other tools that you'll recommend to local churches?
Yeah, at this point, I would hope that your church has gotten to the point where there's a large growing interest. There are a lot of people that are involved. And as a leadership, you're saying, what do we do next? And for that, one of the best organizations that I know about this would be the organization called 1615.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are a couple different things that you can do with them, but they are a missions coaching firm for churches. And so probably the entry door for those is to just go to one of their conferences for churches. I want to say it's 2-3 day conference. So nothing crazy, but it's really, really good in what it looks like to do this. Now, this was started by a guy named Matthew Ellison that was a missions pastor for a number of years,
mm-hmm.
and is taking his experience from that and applying it to other churches to help them to become more of a missions-oriented church. Not that your church is all about missions, but that it is part of that DNA and what it looks like to really incorporate that. And then from that, off of that conference, you can take the kind of the larger commitment or the larger step, and there is a cost involved, but they can coach your church specifically. And so they can come in and really help walk alongside you to develop your church into what your vision for missions is and could be.
Mm-hmm.
So 1615 is a tremendous, tremendous organization with helping churches become what they feel like the Lord is calling them to be as far as missions is concerned.
Well, I'm just going to pile on again, Justin. Matthew is a great guy. We have had him twice on the podcast. And just to absolutely affirm what Justin has said, tremendous resources and tremendous helps for those churches that sense God is moving them forward, but they're going to benefit from the experience coming from the outside, coming alongside. Matthew and his team do a bang-up job of both short-term weekend or short days events. They're down in New Mexico when they've done them physically, I know, but they'll also travel. Excellent resource. And you're part of an organization yourself.
I am. So shameless plug.
Go.
Man, Cafe 1040 is, I would say, a tremendous resource. I know it's biased, but I also work here for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Love what Cafe does, and it's a tremendous mobilization tool. The Overseas Missions Mentorship is for any young adults that are in your congregation that are asking that question. The goal of the program is to help them gain some confidence in living overseas, that they could do it. Kind of like you mentioned, you have to get to that point where you feel like you're about to break. And then you find out, man, God is good and you're not going to break.
Mm-hmm.
And he can sustain you in that. And then also provide some clarity around your calling as to whether you're called to go overseas or not. And so we're a tremendous resource when it comes to that end. And then also our mobilization team. Our goal really is to come alongside you, alongside the local church, the local leadership, to help develop your missions strategy. We want to see the local church succeed, whether it be, Cafe's name is on it or not. We want the Lord to do profound works in your church, and we just want to come up alongside and help you do that in any way that we can.
Excellent summary. Thank you. And again, that's cafe1040.com. If you'd like to take a closer look at that, I'll ask you for contact information before we finish up here today, Justin. Any other tools in this category that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, the last one that I would say there is Missio Nexus. Missio Nexus is just a wealth of missions information, missions strategy, missions training. I mean, golly, I'm trying to think what Missio Nexus doesn't do, or at least provide. There are excellent webinars that they do.
Yep.
They've got some fantastic blogs that provide wonderful information, wonderful training resources. I believe that they even have a theological training school that you can get on there. Missio Nexus allows you an entry point to dive as deep as you want to go in the world of missions. So just a tremendous resource with so much information there.
Very good. We'll make sure that all of those are included in the show notes. And before we finish, we'll go up one more level up once more for us. Justin, what do you recommend for churches that are really coming online now?
Yeah, at this point, I would really recommend connecting with long-term sending organizations. There are some really big organizations that do fantastic work, and there are some smaller organizations that, once again, do fantastic work. There's just a slew of them that really care about the local church and want to come alongside and partner with you, not just so that they can get your people and take them to the field,
right,
but so that they can help you to send well, to partner well, to equip your people well. And at this point, I would say there are probably some questions being raised within the congregation of, I want to go long-term, what do I need to know?
Right.
And long-term sending organizations specialize in specifically that, and they want to help. And so I would connect with a long-term sending organization or multiple ones to provide different pathways for people to go overseas to different areas in different ways and things of that nature.
Very wise advice there. And just to pull back the curtain a little bit, we're working on an episode of the podcast that will help missions committees and pastors ask the right questions about sending organizations to make sure that they have a good resonance together. And some churches have chosen to identify some preferred organizations, for example. And that allows a missions committee to really work proactively to build relationships with sending organizations before someone's particularly interested. And it's less ad hoc. There's more relationship to it. There's more camaraderie to it. So watch for that episode of the podcast coming up soon.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. That sounds like it'll be a fantastic podcast, an extremely helpful tool for the missions committee because it can be overwhelming.
It really can. There are a lot of options. Yeah, we hope it will serve well. I appreciated something you said earlier, Justin, that these organizations exist to serve the body of Christ. We are the servants of the church, not the other way around. And of course, that's one of the questions to ask a sending agency. What's their position in relationship to a local church? We thank the Lord for our pastors, for our missions committees, and we believe that the local church is the primary stakeholder in the Great Commission. There are many stakeholders, but the primary stakeholder is the very body of Christ.
Absolutely.
Well, we have been through a whole bunch of resources here. I wonder if there's anything that you want to add here at this point, anything else that you might tuck in right at the end here, Justin?
With the podcast coming up of how to determine some long-term agencies, I could probably spend the next 30 minutes going through recommendations of agencies. But when it comes to your specific church, your specific vision, it may not be the most beneficial for me to run through all those.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've heard about some great resources for helping prepare a church. Justin, I wonder if you have anything to mention that would help in the working relationship in a local church, and especially maybe between a missions committee and the pastoral team.
Yeah, I think that can be a difficult relationship to navigate, for sure, no doubt about it. And when it comes to, if you're on a missions committee working with a pastor, the real trick is how to navigate those waters without circumventing the pastor.
Exactly.
Because you definitely don't want to do that. And so this is a secular book that I would recommend, but it's a book called How to Lead When You're Not in Charge by Clay Scroggins. It's a really good book on how to, it kind of says it in the title, how to lead when you're not in charge, how to have influence when your title does not designate that influence, and do it in a way that isn't circumventing, it's not taking people out of their roles, and it's not undermining what others are doing, but really gaining that influence in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Well, it can be very helpful. And In all our presentations, we're committed to alignment between the pastoral leadership, which we appreciate so much, and any kind of missions endeavor, that it be on the same page, well-informed, and we don't have pastors concerned about the activity of a missions team or a missions committee, but rather it's in lockstep with a common vision together. So really good advice there, and to do it with grace. Well, in a moment, I've got a last question for you, Justin, but with regard to content. But before I ask that, we've mentioned the website, cafe1040.com. If our listeners would like to follow up with you, either for the cafe or otherwise, how could they do that?
The best way to get in contact with Cafe, if you want to email us, is at hello@cafe1040.com. That'll go out to my mobilization team, and we'll be able to respond to you in a quick fashion.
Super. Great. Well, last question then, Justin. If you have the opportunity to stand in front of a group of church leaders, and this may include these pastors, may include the members of the missions committee, leaders in the church, these are people who want to do global missions and they want to do it well. What would you like to say to them?
I think I'd probably divide it into two different statements, one to the missions committee and then one to the pastor. And to the missions committee, I would say, have patience and diligence. I know that I want to see change overnight and would love to wake up tomorrow and see churches across the nation embracing their roles and taking the gospel to places it's never been. But I also realize there are a lot of moving parts that come into that, and it's one step at a time. My assumption is that they would want the same thing, or at least something similar for their church. So be patient. Move with urgency, but not with haste. Haste always causes problems. To the pastor, and I have the benefit of saying this and then, leaving the room, but I would say that you're not talking about a singular ministry within your church. It's not just a piece of the pie, but the pie tin. The reason that we're even having this conversation is because somewhere in history's past, churches found it worthy to send someone to tell the story of Jesus where it hadn't been told before. We in America exist, or North America exist, in faith because of missions work. Let's not benefit from the work of others and keep it to ourselves. The magnitude of God's glory simply cannot be contained in our church walls, and it must go to the nations. There are people within your congregation that God is calling and wooing to the nations, and as their local church, you have the opportunity to participate in discipling and sending them well. I know it can seem like just another thing to add to your already overloaded plate, so know that there are people willing and wanting to help shoulder the load. Your missions committee here are people within your own congregation that have said that they want to help. There are a myriad of people working for organizations that want to come alongside you. So my encouragement is to take the steps towards mobilizing your congregation, just one small step, and see what God can and will do.
A great word. Thank you. Justin, thank you so much for sharing these resources with us and some of your experience. May the Lord bless you at the cafe. We so appreciate you joining us today on the Global Missions Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Max.
Well, that was a great discussion with Justin. This episode was actually recorded in the fall of 2021. So our team right now is really excited about the launch of the Global Missions Toolbox. We invite you to stop by and check out this new library of resources. It's been assembled for people who simply want to do an excellent job of global missions. globalmissionstoolbox.com. Today's episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening today and for joining our team in the great adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.